Okay, everyone, in this lecture video, what I'm going to be going through are the different types of movement that the different joints inside of your body are capable of performing. Okay, so again, with the motion that we're going to be looking at today, we're going to be looking at the different structural types of joints. So the 6 different kinds we talked about in the last video, again, gliding, pivot, ellipsoidal, those different joints, and essentially what kinds of motion you can get at those. So in those, I'm going to talk about examples of the different kinds of motion, what those might look like, and kind of where you can see those. But what I'd encourage you to do is try these out, right? I posted a link to another video where you can, I posted a link to an example of where you can see drawings of these different types of motion. Okay. All right, so let's talk about movement. Okay, so in anatomy, like with anything else we've learned so far this year, is that anatomy is going to use specific terminology to describe any kind of motion. Okay, and these movement terms, remember, can be viewed as pairs. There's always going to be an antagonistic movement to one type, right? And the reason why that is because we know that muscles are only able to pull, right? They're only able to pull on a particular part, and there's got to be something that's pulling backwards the other way in order to make it return to its original position. Okay, so again, given that the movements are going across in these opposite pairs, right? If you know one of the terms, like flexion, you should know the other one, extension. And that's just know that there's going to be an opposite to those. Okay, and that's so you can return back to that starting position. Again, we're assuming anatomical position is the starting position. All right, so with our movement terms, right, we have already defined this. This is what we've been talking about, right? The study of human motion and non-human body movement is the idea of kinesiology, right? We're really interested in understanding how the movement occurs within a particular structure, right? In order to understand how we can potentially diagnose it and help improve it, right? To be more efficient about the type of motion, as well as how we can prevent injury. Okay, so again, kinesiology is the study of that. Okay, so with our types of movement in the human body, again, all of these are directly linked to a synovial joint, right? All the different kinds of motion that we're going to be seeing here can occur at particular types of structural joints. So structurally, you might see this particular kind of motion happen at like a ball and socket only, or you might see it happen in both a pivot joint as well as a ellipsoidal joint, right? You're going to have instances where multiple different types of motion can occur in a particular joint. So just keep that in mind. Okay, but here are 4 broad categories, right? The kind of 4 types that we're going to have. So the first is a gliding motion. So again, this is where 2 surfaces slide past each other. Okay, so with a gliding motion, again, those examples similar to our structural components, right? Those are going to be things that are going to occur like in your carpals, that kind of stuff. Angular motion is, again, movement that increases or decreases the angles between bones. Probably, again, our most famous example of this is going to be what's happening at a hinge joint. Again, what's happening at your elbow or your knee, where all you're doing is increasing the angle, so making it bigger, or decreasing the angle, making it smaller. So again, like with my finger flexion, right, I can, if I'm going here from anatomical position, if I flex in these different things, right, again, I'm decreasing the angle between the bones, and here I'm increasing the angle between the bones. Okay. Our next type is rotational motion. So again, this is motion that's going to allow the body to move around a particular axis, usually in this case a longitudinal axis of the body, right, in order for you to either look left, look right, do any of that kind of particular motion type. Okay, and then our last type of motion is special motion, or special movements. Again, these are terms related to motion that doesn't necessarily fit in any of the other categories. It's not a gliding, it's not an angular, it's not a rotation. It might be an amalgamation of all of those different things, or it's specifically looking at a particular type of the body, or part in the body. So like your feet, for example, have a lot of different specialized motions because of the structure of your ankle. Same with your wrist, same with your fingers. There's just a lot of other special terms that are out there that don't necessarily apply to multiple joints, but only apply to specific places on the human body. Okay. All right, so let's talk about those different motion terms. So what do we have in terms of our different kinds of motion? Okay. Okay. All right, see, look at that gliding motion. All right, so let's talk about the different terms. So the first type that we have here is a gliding motion. So this is when 2 surfaces are sliding past each other, okay? So if you have your 2 joints here and you have the articulation, right, they're going to be rotating past each other like this. Okay, so one surface slides over the other one. So again, this generally happens at a gliding joint. So again, maybe some amphiarthritic joints are going to be in here in terms of this thing, but mainly with synovial joints, we're talking about what's happening in the carpals, what's either happening in your thumb, right, as you're moving on that particular saddle joint. Right, again, there's going to be gliding motion that's there. Okay, our next 3 terms, so I'm going to kind of talk about them all together, are all those related to, generally, if you're thinking about these are more like hinge joint kinds of things. Again, this is movement where we're dealing with angles that are increasing and decreasing. Okay, so what's really important when we're talking about our motion terms is we got to think back to the planes of the human body that we learned at the very beginning, right? The idea that we're moving into or out of those planes if we're cutting the body into a front and back, okay, or on a left and a right. Again, that's going to help orient you in terms of the type of motion we're going to be addressing. Okay, so let's talk about flexion. So flexion is a type of motion where you're moving into an interior or anterior plane. Okay, so you're either going into the front of your body or going out into the back of the body, right? If I'm looking at the side of my hand, right, if I'm dividing my hand into the plane, remember the palm side is going to be posterior, the side is anterior. So if I'm going into this plane right here, that means that I have some kind of movement into the frontal plane. If I go behind, which I can't do with that, but if I say go behind, here I do that, flexing my wrist. If I hyperextend my wrist, if I do that, then I'm able to go backwards into the posterior plane. Okay, so if I'm in anatomical position, right, increasing my angle, decreasing or increasing the angle or decreasing the angle in either direction, right, making it smaller because I'm moving my carpals and palm closer to my radius and ulna, right? But in each case, there's a slightly different way we would describe it. So flexion is the idea where you're moving into or out of, or moving into the anterior plane or moving into the posterior plane that reduces the angle between the bones, okay? Generally, when we're talking about this, we're going into the anterior plane because hyperextension is kind of going into the posterior plane most of the time. But here, just decrease the angle. So if I like flex at my finger, right, I've decreased the angle between, say, these bones of my finger and what's happening in my metacarpals, okay? So that's flexion. Extension is the idea of going in that same plane, but back to the original position. So I'm increasing the angle. So here I have an angle that's like, say, 180, right? Here I go down to 90, back to 180. So that's extension. So flexion, extension, flexion, extension. Hyperextension is where you're going past anatomical position. Generally, with hyperextension, the reason why I bring this up as a motion term is that you can hyperextend a lot of things in your body, and it's totally natural, right? The idea that if I take this from anatomical position and flex in my wrist and go backwards, right, that's hyperextension. I'm going into the posterior plane past anatomical position, right, because I'm decreasing the angle between these, but I'm extending it beyond what I would normally do, right? So if I take my wrist and I flex, right, I'm going this way, but as I extend here, I'm back in anatomical position, but I'm able to go behind. So that was what we would call as hyperextension. So like if you take your head and lean it backwards and let out a heavy sigh, like I'm sure all of you are doing right now, right, that's an example where you're hyperextending, okay? So hyperextension, the reason why I bring that up is another term that people get confused about is that often when people hear the term hyperextension, they think like injury, okay? If you hyperextend generally like in most of your joints, it's going to be an injury, right? It's where you're extending beyond the range of motion, what your bones are capable of handling, what your ligaments are able to do in terms of stretching. And hyperextension is oftentimes an example of an injury that's very readily easy for someone to get, especially someone who begins working out early on, is that they don't necessarily know their full range of motion. They can't necessarily handle, like if they're lifting a lot of weight or something like that, they can often hyperextend like at the knee or at the shoulder or the elbow when they're trying to do some particular type of motion. Okay. All right, let's move into our next terms. So these terms, instead of going into kind of that frontal plane or posterior plane, we're going along the transverse plane of the body. Okay, or sorry, not the transverse plane, we're going along the frontal plane of the body. So we're staying within that. Okay, so I always think of this as like if you're standing and doing jumping jacks. It's kind of the easiest example that I can give you for these particular terms. Okay, so abduction and adduction, those are the antagonistic terms. So if you're abducting, what you're essentially doing is moving away from the body along that frontal plane. So if you like gently raise your arm up to the left, right, or to the right, that's an example where you're experiencing that particular type of motion. Okay, so you're abducting, or AB is away, so you're taking it away from the body as a whole. Okay, adduction is where you're bringing the body in, so your movement goes towards the longitudinal axis. So if you say you're going back to anatomical position from raising your hands upward, right, that would be adduction. So with that one, I remember it's like you're adding to the body, right? You're bringing the motion into the body as a whole. Okay. The last one, circumduction, is where you're moving the body in. So back to my jumping jack example, right? If you're jumping outward, right, and like spreading your legs out wide and your arms out wide, that's abduction. If you're jumping back to original position, that's adduction. The other type of motion here that I bring in is called circumduction, and this is where you're able to move that articulation point in a complete circle. Okay, there's really the only type of joint that's allowing you to do that is that a ball and socket joint. You may feel like you can do that at your fingers, you may feel like you can do that at your thumb, you may feel like you can do that at your wrist, and the answer is you cannot, right? Is that those are more ellipsoidal. Like again, if you take your finger and you like try to draw a circle with your thumb like this, right, you're not going to be able to get a perfect circle. Okay, right? If you're feeling at that joint, you're keeping it just moving at that joint, you're not going to be able to do that. Okay. If, however, though, then you take your whole arm and you're moving your whole, like at your elbow, not your elbow, at your shoulder, you're going to be able to do that. You're going to be able to draw a perfect circle on the board, for example. Okay. Our next three types of motion all deal with moving on a particular axis. Okay, so these are all going to be at rotational joints. So the examples that we're going to get here are going to be what's going to happen in your neck. So if you're looking left, looking right, that's rotation. Again, you're turning along that particular part of your body. So it involves you turning your head around that longitudinal axis. So looking left, looking right, or your atlas and axis, those are going to be rotations. Okay. You can rotate at your spine. Again, a lot of those little motions coming together, you can do a full rotation there. And you can look left or right. Again, like each individual spine can't rotate a lot, but if you add a whole bunch of them together, you can get quite a bit of motion. The next two, pronation and supination, these are motions that require you to go or allow you to do like this. So again, if you're palm up, which is what is an anatomical position, right, you are prone, all right, or sorry, you're supine. So if your palm is facing outward, right, you can take your hands and you can hold the soup. Here's holding soup. All right, as that means you're supine. All right, if you take your wrist and you rotate it backwards and look at the posterior side, that's prone, right? So I've gone supination. Pronation is when I rotate and do that. So if you're like single-lating it, right, you're just pronating, supinating over and over and over again, okay? And that's going to be happening at your radial ulnar joint. Okay? So again, rotation of the palm so it's facing anteriorly is going to be supine. Again, you can hold sup. Pronation is where your palm is up. Okay, so your pro palm. Or sorry, your palm is down. Your pro back of your hand, right? And then our last types of motion here, these are all examples of specialized motion. Most of these deal with what's happening in your hand and your feet, okay? So with these, let's see if I can zoom in a little bit. All right, is inversion and eversion, okay? So this is with your foot. So if you're taking your foot, like if we pretend that this is my foot as a whole, right? It's the beauty of this, like it's very similar, right? If we're looking at the top of my foot, right? If we're looking at inversion, what we're doing is we're taking the bottom of the sole of our foot and we're facing it inward. Okay, so we're doing this. So you're like rotating your ankle so that the bottom of your foot is facing this way. Eversion is where you take it and you're rotating it out that way. Okay, so inversion towards the inside, eversion towards the outside. Again, you're moving it inward towards the medial thing. Eversion is lateral towards the outside. Okay. Dorsiflexion and plantar flexion, so that's dealing with, again, your foot. And so if you're doing dorsiflexion, that's where you have flexion at the angle that elevates the sole and your heel is down. So you're taking your like heel like down here and you're like lifting it up. You're doing this. So you're going down and up. That's dorsiflexion. Plantar flexion is if you're, say, in the ballet, you're standing on point. So you're like standing on your tippy toes. That's plantar flexion. Protraction and retraction, these are things that happen on a horizontal plane. So probably the best example I can give you for protraction and retraction is if you do protraction, it's like you're jutting your jaw out. Or you like, can't really show you. I'm going to make the sound as I do it. All right, is that you're taking your jaw and you're kind of jutting it outward. Protraction is bringing, or retraction is bringing your jaw back in. Okay. And then lastly is opposition. So with opposition, what you're doing is you're taking your thumbs and pinkies and you're touching them to each other. So again, these are specialized, right, where you're taking these and joining them together. Okay. So that's the broad overview of the different types of motion. I would suggest you look at the other images I posted of the different kinds of motion that are there so you can see some diagrammatic views of it, or you can, or try them out, right? See if you can define what they are. All right. So if you've got questions, let me know.